All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Rahul Saxena. I'm a staff attorney at Palestine Legal. I'm based in Chicago. And I think at the end of this presentation, I've included my email address, so you can feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call if you have any questions. Okay, so let's begin. This is a relatively quick Know Your Rights presentation on anti BDS legislation. As many of you know, there has been a wave of legislation introduced in states across the country, as well as in Congress, that tries to target the BDS movement, tries to suppress Palestine solidarity activists and suppress their rights through legislation. So I'm going to give kind of a quick overview of some of those bills and resolutions. I kind of have three main goals for this. One is to put these legislative efforts in the context of the overall BDS movement. Also, the second is to let you know about what some of those legislative efforts are. I'm going to focus mainly on three bills that have passed. There's only been three so far that have actually passed state legislatures. And I think it's really important for Palestine solidarity activists in the U.S. to understand what those bills do, but most importantly, to understand what they don't do. How they don't affect your rights primarily to endorse and engage in boycotts of Israel. And three, I want to kind of describe some of the strategies that have been employed by activists across the country to fight these bills, and also hopefully to get some feedback, some ideas, start getting folks on this call thinking about what additional tactics can be used to fight future bills, because we expect a slew of new BDS bills to be coming in the next year or two. So to begin with, let's put the boycott movement in context. So as you all know, the BDS movement is growing in the U.S. And as it grows, legislators and the Israel lobby across the country is rushing to react. They're saying, what can we do to stop this human rights movement? Especially among students, academic associations, and religious institutions who are really increasingly embracing the BDS movement. Legislators and Israel advocacy groups are brainstorming ways to respond. And so over the course of this presentation, I'm kind of going to talk about the evolution over the past 2 years, or over the past year really, of these responses. But I want, as I do that, because the strategies employed by legislators and Israel advocacy groups has evolved over the past year, and that's in large part because of bullet point number 3, which is something to really keep in mind, that the Supreme Court of the U.S. has long held that boycotts to bring about political, social, and economic change are protected by the First Amendment, and that's really important. Because no state and no federal law can limit your right to boycott Israel in protest of Israeli policies, or your right to advocate BDS. So, we'll see. I'm going to talk a little bit about in a minute some legislative efforts have more directly targeted First Amendment protected speech, targeted boycotts very directly, and we've seen that all those legislative efforts have failed. And so keep in mind that this fact that your right to boycott is protected by the U.S. Constitution. I also want to point out the difference between bills versus resolutions. This is probably not news to most people, but bills become law. A bill is a legislator's way of making law. The legislatures across the country pass bills, governors sign them, and then they become law. Resolutions are very different. I'm going to focus. So resolutions are basically, they don't have the force of law. They allow legislatures to recognize people or events or issues without making law. I call them basically glorified press releases. And so I'm going to focus in this presentation mostly on bills. I will talk about resolutions very briefly at the end. With resolutions, the primary thing to keep in mind, our concern at Palestine Legal, our concern as Palestine solidarity activists is not just the fact that when a legislature passes a bill that might infringe on our First Amendment rights, but we're also concerned that when a legislature passes a bill or a resolution, that can have a chilling effect on our speech. Even though our speech is guaranteed by the First Amendment, whenever our government takes a stand, takes a position, makes a statement against human rights, that has a chilling effect on what we think we can do and can't do. And so it makes it really important to understand exactly what these different laws do and don't do. All right. So I'm going to start with 2014. As you likely know, there was the American Studies Association, I think in 2013, endorsed the boycott, endorsed BDS, and legislators across the country rushed to figure out what to do in response to that. So bills aimed at punishing the American Studies Association were introduced in New York, Illinois, Maryland, as well as in Congress. And kind of the intent of these bills was to say, legislators and the Israel lobby said, we can't accept this growing BDS movement. It's not okay for the American Studies Association to embrace it. What can the government do to protect Israel, to protect the status quo? And so these bills that were introduced in different legislatures across the country basically sought to withdraw state funding from universities that fund ASA, the American Studies Association. That was a problem on a lot of levels. And luckily, activists fought back. I'm going to focus on one of those states, New York. None of those bills passed. But what is the problem with this approach? The problem is, we, under the U.S. Constitution, as I mentioned, have a fundamental right to engage in boycotts to bring about political, economic, and social change. That means that no legislature, no government official, no government entity can say what is okay speech and what is not okay. And so by the government potentially saying we're not going to fund a university because of one type of speech, that violates the Constitution. And so in New York, activists came together. Maybe some of you on this call were part of that effort. But activists across the state came together, Palestine solidarity activists, Jewish Voice for Peace members, and others came together and kind of had this very effective, what I see as a three-pronged strategy to defeat this bill. One was that they built a grassroots coalition of not just Palestine solidarity activists, but also civil rights groups, civil liberties groups, the teachers union, all opposed this bill. There was a strong legal response. So Palestine Legal, the Center for Constitutional Rights, National Lawyers Guild, the New York Civil Liberties Union, all sent letters and legislative memos, legal memos to legislators in New York, saying basically this bill not only violates academic freedom, violates the First Amendment, but we're concerned about the chilling effect that it's going to have on speech of those who choose to dissent and choose to go against the power structure and choose to counter what you as legislators think is okay. And there was a very effective media strategy, and that media strategy really culminated in an amazing New York Times editorial against the bill. And the New York Times editorialized, they said the New York bill is an ill-considered response to the American Studies Association resolution and would trample on academic freedoms and would chill free speech and dissent. So as a result of this effort, I'm just going to go back. It says at the top, the state Senate in New York actually passed this bill. Senator Jeff Klein, who was the co-leader of the state Senate, introduced the bill and got it passed. In the assembly at that time, Shelley Silver, who's pictured here, who has subsequently been arrested for unrelated reasons, he introduced the bill, and there was so much pressure on him that he ultimately withdrew it after the New York Times article. So that was I think a huge success for Palestine solidarity activists in New York. And I would love to hear from folks on this call, especially if you were part of that. Maybe at the end, if we have a little bit of time for question and answer or discussion, what you thought was a good strategy then, or what additional tactics could have been used that we could replicate in other states. So that was 2014. The 2014 bills focused on the ASA resolution. They focused on academic freedom, cracking down on academic freedom, and they were all defeated. So fast forward to this year, legislators, the BDS movement continues to grow. Legislators decide, all right, maybe that ASA academic freedom approach is not the best approach because it so blatantly violates the First Amendment. So what else can we do? And this year, we've seen for the first time bills actually pass both houses of state legislatures in Illinois and South Carolina, as well as the federal government. So it's important to know. I'm gonna talk about these three bills. It's important to keep in mind that they don't limit and they can't limit our ability to advocate for BDS. And then I also want to mention that there still are a bunch of other bills pending in other states, including Pennsylvania, that are very troubling, but none of them have passed yet. We're continuing to monitor them, and I'm happy to answer any questions about those if folks have them. All right, so earlier this year, Illinois became the first state in the country to pass an anti-BDS bill. This bill, as a side note, this bill actually, it passed both houses of the legislature. It was sent to the governor about a month ago. He hasn't yet signed it, so it's technically not law yet. He has 60 days to veto it if he wants to, although we suspect he's not going to veto it. After 60 days, it'll automatically become law. So it's kind of in a gray area right now, past the legislature, but not yet law. So what does this Illinois bill do? So the final version of the bill, the version that ultimately passed, was very different than the original version. The final version requires the state pension fund to divest from companies that boycott Israel. It also sets up a blacklist of those companies. I don't know if folks on this call are from Illinois, but there was a really interesting evolution of this bill as well. Earlier in the year, the original version of the bill looked very different than this, and was changed because activists and legal organizations, including the ACLU of Illinois, strongly opposed the original version. The original version said, A, we're going to set up that blacklist, and B, we're going to prohibit the state from doing any business with any companies on that list. We're gonna invalidate any contracts, state contracts with any businesses on that blacklist, and that approach directly contravened clear Supreme Court case law. We pointed that out to the legislators, and they decided to amend the bill. And so the final version of the bill said we're going to divest our state pension fund from any of those companies that boycott Israel. The most important takeaway, I think, is that this bill does not affect anybody's right to engage in BDS activism or to boycott Israel. I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there. A lot of people know that Illinois passed an anti-BDS bill, and that has a chilling effect on their activism, which is wrong, and people need to know that this bill does not affect your right to boycott Israel, does not affect your right to advocate BDS. Separate question is this bill constitutional? We're pursuing, we're doing a lot of research, and we're trying to think about what a legal strategy might look like. we strongly believe that any use of financial levers to punish or discourage speech raises really serious First Amendment concerns. It's a little bit less clear as the original version of the bill, but we don't think that this approach is okay, and more importantly, we don't think it's okay for our state government or any state government to pass laws that are intended at punishing human rights advocacy, right? Like our government should be in the business of protecting and advancing human rights, not at punishing human rights. And so we're concerned about the chilling effect that this statement, our government making this statement against BDS, will have on activist rights. So that's Illinois. The second state this year that passed an anti BDS bill was South Carolina. That's my picture of Nikki Haley. And the South Carolina bill was actually very different. Nowhere in the bill, it actually is now law, and Governor Nikki Haley did sign it into law. Nowhere in this new law does it say Israel. Nowhere does it mention BDS. Nowhere does it mention Palestine or Palestinians or settlements or anything. It's a very neutrally written law. We know that the bill drafter's intent was to punish BDS because of statements that were made in the press. We know that this bill was drafted because the legislators in South Carolina wanted to take a stand against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So what does this bill do? It basically prohibits the government of South Carolina or any governmental entity in South Carolina from doing business with companies that boycott based on race, religion, gender, or national origin. So, right off the bat, you can see it's an anti-discrimination law. It uses very neutral language. We, as a civil rights organization, support anti-discrimination laws. We think that anti-discrimination laws are very important to protecting to ensuring equal protection of all citizens in this country, citizens or non-citizens. But we are troubled by the fact that this is a new law that was intended to punish First Amendment protected human rights advocacy. So again, the same takeaway as before. How does this affect your rights if you live in South Carolina or elsewhere? It doesn't. Sorry, I should specify. How does this affect your right to engage in boycotts of Israel? It doesn't. The reason why I say that is because we strongly believe that the BDS movement is not national origin discrimination. We believe that we are advocating, the BDS activists are advocating boycotts, a boycott of Israeli companies to protest human rights abuses and policies of Israel, not to protest Israel. And I think that there's a really important distinction to be made there. So, that leads to the question, is this constitutional? And across the country, there are anti-discrimination laws that often, in some ways, conflict with First Amendment protected speech. And there is a fine balancing act that often plays out in the courts. And sorry, I saw a question pop up, but I wasn't able to read it. So feel free to interrupt me if there was a question. So how do we balance this anti-discrimination intent of the law versus the fact that it might be used to prohibit First Amendment protected speech? And what we argue is that the anti-discrimination intent of the law is fine. We agree with it. We support it. If this law were used as applied, if this law were used to punish First Amendment protected human rights boycotts of Israel, that would be unconstitutional as applied, and that's something that we would probably challenge in court. Was there a question? Or maybe I should stop right now and just generally ask, are there any questions or comments about anything I've said so far?
Hi, well, this is Jay. Carol brought up a good point, which was just that the fact that a boycott is temporary, i.e. only until the occupation ends, should be a factor in legal decisions. That is, the boycott is not on the basis of national origin, but on the basis of a specific behavior, occupying and oppressing. So I'm not sure if that's a question. It's just an add-on to what you were saying, which is great.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. That's a good point. And you know, as a side note, it's not included in this presentation because it's not a new law, but there is. If anybody lives in New York, New York human rights law actually has a very similar provision. It basically makes it illegal to boycott based on race, religion, gender, or national origin in New York, and it is an anti-discrimination law. And there have been threats against, for example, co-ops in New York that want to endorse boycotts of Israel. There have been threats against them saying, like, if you endorse a boycott, that's going to violate New York's human rights law, and we are going to sue you. That's what, you know, the Israel advocacy groups are saying. And that has intimidated people. That has made them shy away from wanting to endorse boycotts. It's had a chilling effect on their speech. It's a big, big problem. And folks need to realize that your right to boycott Israel to bring about political, social, and economic change is fundamentally protected by the First Amendment. No local, state, or federal law can override that. And further, I completely agree with this notion that the human rights boycotts of Israel are not about national origin. They're about human rights, you know. So there's still that question of whether this law would apply or not.
Sorry, this is Jay again, everyone. For those who just joined us, I've muted everyone just for the purposes so that we can hear Rahul present. If you have a question, go ahead, and if you want to ask it within the presentation, you can type it into the little message box on the bottom left, and I will try and interrupt Rahul and ask it within the context of the presentation. But if it's more a general question, or we will have a question period at the end of our time. So save those questions if you can, and we will be able to, I will unmute everyone and we'll all ask them then. All right? Go ahead, Rahul.
Great. So no more immediate questions right now, or should I move on?
No more for now.
Okay, great. All right, so law number, the third and final law that passed in 2015 so far. Oops. Some of you may have heard that, you know, there's been, I'm sure you've heard that there's been a huge debate publicly about this fast track issue at the federal level. Should Congress give the president authority, the fast track authority on these various free trade bills that are pending, free trade negotiations that are pending? At the end of June, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the president signed the fast track bill that passed into law. Some of you may be aware that tucked into that bill, it was a huge bill that did many things. Tucked deep inside of that bill was an anti BDS provision. It was the first anti BDS provision that was part of a federal law that passed and was signed into law. And so what did it do? I've written down what exactly it said. It says, you know, Congress is basically telling the president to make discouraging politically motivated boycotts of Israel a principal objective of ongoing free trade negotiations with the European Union. So, you know, the U.S. and the European Union are engaged in these ongoing free trade negotiations. Congress wants the president to take a stand of discouraging boycotts of Israel during those negotiations. It also included language aimed at legitimizing settlements. So I have a lot of things to say about this, but I'll try to keep it brief. As with any anti-BDS bill that has passed or is pending, I think that there are a lot of problems with it. I think anytime our government passes a law that aims at suppressing human rights activism, that's a problem. I think that we as human rights activists and advocates, we as Palestine solidarity activists, we should strongly oppose all these bills not only because we think that our government should be advancing human rights, but also because even if these bills don't directly affect our First Amendment rights, there is always a concern that they will chill speech in this country, and that's a problem. That being said, this specific law, it's a lot more bark than bite. The Israel advocacy groups hailed it as a major victory. AIPAC basically wrote this, and they said, I think basically they had two goals with it. One was to write language, to write law that legitimized settlements, and two, I think they wanted to pass an anti BDS bill. I think that they failed. I personally think that even though I think this was a terrible law and it should not have passed and we should be up in arms about it, I think AIPAC and the Israel lobby failed on both of those two counts. One, in terms of settlements, even after, as soon as Obama signed that law, his administration very publicly said, we are basically going to ignore the settlement language. The language that was included in this law runs counter to, U.S. policy regarding settlements, decades-long-standing U.S. policy regarding settlements, and we're going to ignore that provision. And two, in terms of this being, Congress passing an anti-BDS bill, I think that it's really, really telling that the first and only law Congress has passed regarding BDS was part of an international trade bill. There are plenty of other anti-BDS bills that have been introduced in Congress, bills that actually would inhibit our right to endorse boycotts, to advocate for boycotts. None of those bills have passed for one very simple reason, which is that they would most likely be unconstitutional. And so I almost see this as a desperate attempt to legislate against BDS using the only potentially constitutional means. And again, I think it's more bark than bite. It doesn't require the president necessarily to do anything. It says we want you to take a position of discouraging boycotts when you negotiate with the EU. It doesn't say you have to oppose any agreement that involves a boycott. It doesn't quantify what that looks like. It just gives him general guidelines of what his position should be. So again, I personally believe that we should continue fighting these, continue to stand up against these, but I think that this particular one is more bark than bite. All right. So that was kind of like a quick review of the three anti-BDS bills that have actually passed so far. As I mentioned before, there are still other bills pending in state legislatures across the country that do various things. I would be surprised if the 2014 kind of iteration of bills, the ones that directly try to attack First Amendment protected speech, I would be surprised if any of those actually pass. But we should continue to be vigilant and continue to think creatively about how we counter this wave of really this concerted attack on BDS through legislatures. I want to turn quickly now to resolutions. And I wrote this headline: legislators get bored, pass toothless anti-BDS resolutions. I say that because, I think that so far this year, legislators in Indiana, Tennessee, New York, Pennsylvania have passed resolutions condemning the BDS movement. As I've already said in a couple of different times, I think that it's a tragedy. I think that it's a shame anytime any division of government passes resolution opposing human rights activism. Again, I think it's the role of our government to advance human rights. That being said, I think it's very telling that legislatures are passing resolutions. Resolutions are toothless. I think that I refer to them often as glorified press releases. They don't have the force of law. They're just statements made by legislators. We should oppose them. we should be concerned about the chilling effect that they have on activism. But we should also make people aware that they don't have any effect on our rights. And while we should be concerned, we should also realize that in a way it's in a way it's good that legislators are not passing bills, they're passing resolutions. I think that's a testament to the fact that BDS activism is working, and that a lot of people, the power structures out there, the folks that don't want to see change happen, the folks that don't want to see human rights for Palestine and Palestinians, they want to do something to oppose this growing, increasingly successful movement, and all they can do really is pass toothless anti-BDS resolutions. So that's my take on resolutions. I'm sure that there are people out there that disagree with me, and I would love to hear what you think in the Q&A session. So finally, I just want to say a bit about advocacy strategies. I talked a bit about it in the context of New York, but I would love to go back to it to wrap up, just to review what has been done at the grassroots level, but also to hopefully get some more thoughts from all of you about what you think is our effective strategies to counter legislation, and to figure out what we can do moving forward, because we do expect we don't expect the Israel lobby to give up on legislation anytime soon, and we need to keep fighting them. So things that have been done, coalition building, as I mentioned. I think it's really important for Palestine solidarity activists to build coalitions, to build solidarity with labor organizations, civil rights, civil liberties groups, LGBTQ groups, immigrant rights groups, anybody whose struggles can be related, I think, have a vested interest in this, and I think that our movement has a vested interest in their movement, and I think it's really important, and it's really powerful to take that coalition work to legislators and say, listen, we're all against what you're doing, and you better stop doing it. Action alerts, I have mixed feelings about them. I think it's really important to give people at the grassroots concrete actions to take. That being said, I've also had a semi-unfortunate career, I would say career, what's the word I'm looking for? I had a little swerve in my career earlier where I actually worked for a legislator for a brief amount of time, and I wasn't convinced that action alerts were that were that effective. I think that a much more effective, legislators are concerned, if you think from the perspective of legislators are concerned with what the public perceives of them. If a legislator receives 100 emails from people, A, they don't know where those people live, they don't know if they're constituents, and B, nobody else in the world knows that they received those 100 emails. However, something more public like social media stuff or letters to the editor, op-eds in the media, public things that call out legislators that people everywhere can see and read, I personally feel that is a much more effective tool. And then I skipped legal letters and memoranda. So, we at Palestine Legal, we often team up with folks like the Center for Constitutional Rights, National Lawyers Guild, ACLU chapters, and others, and we draft legal letters, we draft legal memoranda, we send them to legislators pointing out all the First Amendment concerns that we have, not just in terms of straight-up violations of Supreme Court case law, but also in terms of the chilling effect that legislation has on activists' rights. And that's been a and we found that that's been a really effective tool to get legislators to back off of the most blatantly constitutionally the types of legislation that violate the Constitution most blatantly. But what we found is that instead of giving up. A lot of times legislators will redraft their bill the way they did in Illinois to be maybe a little slightly more constitutionally sound, still problematic, but then we'll go past that. So that's why it's really important for grassroots activists, community groups, advocacy groups to get their voice heard on why these bills are not just legally problematic, but also problematic as policy. You know, these are anti-human rights bills, and they need to be opposed not just for violating our First Amendment speech, but also because our government needs to advance and protect human rights, not the other way around. Okay. So then, you know, what additional creative strategies should we employ? That's how I would love to end this. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, but I'd also love to engage in a discussion about what folks on this call have done that they've found effective in the legislative realm, or any other ideas you might have for what we can do as legal organizations, what we can do as grassroots Palestine solidarity activists across the country. And then there's my email address. So that's it.
Well, Don had coordinated this, and I think wanted to express his appreciation to you, Rahul, for participating in answering some of our challenging questions, and we really do appreciate the information, and hope to coordinate with you and supplement our efforts. Monica typed a message also saying thank you. We're very grateful.
Thank you all so much for having me. I hope it was helpful, and I don't know if you can still see my screen, but on our website, PalestineLegal.org, we also have a resources page that has more info on like legal issues around BDS legislation and other things like that. So feel free to look around on that.